Imagine you are making a chocolate souffle. Now, bear with me on this. This is going somewhere. You want to make the best souffle that you can, and so you get the best ingredients. Chocolate from Belgium, organic eggs and vanilla, raw sugar. You beat the eggs exactly as you're supposed to do. You fold, you whip, you blend to perfection. You get everything together perfectly, and then you slam it into the oven, cook it for too long at the wrong temperature. Now, I don't care where you got the ingredients from. If you screw up the baking, it's all for naught. And that's kind of how I felt about this movie. Star of Acre is a 2023 horror movie about a couple dealing with the loss of their son on a family farm when they start to believe in a series of old legends that may be true. To be fair, this movie doesn't become unwatchable, but given the ingredients that it put together, it should have been amazing. And instead, it's got pacing issues that really drag it down to a point where it loses its impact. It's such a shame, too, because these ingredients are so good. The movie centers around an English family, Richard, Juliet, and Owen, that have recently moved to the countryside to take up residence at Richard's boyhood home. Now, right off the bat, it stars two all-star actors in Matt Smith and Morfydd Clark. Also, I don't know when the year of the movie is set in, but it seems to be sometime in the 70s. And I've said before, I think there is something about horror movies set in the 70s that I really like. Like, I just like the decor, the color palette that was prevalent then, leads itself to a creepy horror movie, especially folk horror. And I've also mentioned before how much I love folk horror films. I love the history of old legends and stories that come back and have some sort of resurgence in like the present day of the film. It's infinitely creepy to me. So anyway, it's the happy couple and their, I think, 5-year-old son in this new farmhouse location, tending to animals and things like that. Richard is a school teacher, and he and his son like to take walks on the sprawling property, and he tells Owen about an old oak tree that used to be on the property and how important it was as a central meeting place for everyone in the village. And Owen mentions wanting to find that old oak tree. Anyway, everything seems okay until Owen begins exhibiting some troubling behavior. He gets aggressive with some animals and some kids at school, and so they have to bring him to a counselor. Now, without the benefit of modern psychology, they do the best they can, but the boy begins talking about stories of an old fairy tale character called Jack Gray. Now, this troubles Richard because he had a bit of a drunk and abusive father, and his father used to tell him about this character of Jack to scare him when he was a kid. So he's very interested to know how his son has heard of him, despite no one seeming to tell him about it. Soon tragedy kind of strikes, though, and an accident occurs with Owen, and he dies. Now, that may sound like a mid-movie spoiler, but that's really just the setup. So don't worry about it. I didn't really ruin any major plot point or anything. The couple now are dealing with the grief of the lost son, and each bury themselves in their own way. He goes out and starts doing excavating in the yard to find the old oak, and she sleeps and paints or repaints the bedrooms. Now, as you can imagine, this puts a lot of stress on their marriage. As Richard continues to dig, he begins uncovering old bits of things in the yard that take on very strange behaviors, and he soon finds it has a connection to the old stories that his dad used to tell him about. Meanwhile, Juliet begins to feel like there is some kind of presence in the house, and her sister and her neighbor encourage Juliet to do these meditations, or I say rituals. I don't want to use the word rituals because it's not really a ritual. It is more of like hippie kind of spiritualistic kind of thing in order to release these feelings. Now, this is where most of the movie sits. And this is also where some of the problem lies. It's in this sort of second act of the film where the movie kind of stretches out at such a slow pace that I began to wonder if we were ever actually getting somewhere. Everything was just incrementally moving and things happened, but none of it felt like it was coming together in a way that drove my curiosity. Now, with any story like this, where there's a mystery element, It's a tough line to walk where you don't want to reveal too much to the audience, but you also don't want to spread it out too thin and risk losing them. And this is one where it rides way too close to the losing them line for me. Now, it didn't lose me entirely, but I did find myself wondering at what point all of these pieces were going to start kind of explaining themselves a bit more. It kept introducing new things without really clicking together those pieces in place in a satisfying way. It started to get that, and then this happened story elements, which is never a good thing. Now, when it finally does start to click together and make more sense, I just thought it was way too late in the story, and then it kind of wrapped itself up so fast that it never really got in a good rhythm. Now, typically, the end of the second act is where all things are kind of revealed and it sets up the stakes and journey for the final resolution and action is needed for the end of the film to happen. But I felt like this needed to happen about 15 or 20 minutes earlier in this film than it actually does. And the third act could have used some real fleshing out a bit more. Now, I get it. Pacing is such a subjective thing when it comes to movies. I mean, it mostly falls in the internal rhythm of the person watching the film, where you might be into something and then all of a sudden you find your mind kind of drifting. So I'm sure there are people that will be fine with how this movie plays itself out. And as I said, the top ingredients here are fantastic. I mean, if I didn't know the actors involved and someone said that I'm watching a movie from 1978, I might have believed them. Now, I happen to be into cameras and lenses, and I always try and guess or find out what a film was shot with. Now, I couldn't find out anywhere what this one was shot with, but they must have used a bunch of old lenses because the way the light hits them causes all sorts of these like imperfections on the image, and you usually can't get that with just simple post-processing. Now, add to that an amazing production design and costumes, and the whole thing had such an authentic vibe to it. I really can't praise it enough for that. I just found it so disappointing that with the setup that it had, it kind of drags itself out far too long and then ends so quickly, it's just unsatisfying, even though the story is interesting enough. And like that souffle with the great ingredients at the wrong temperature, ends up being a bit overbaked. I'd give this movie a B-, but let me know what you think.